Welcome back, college football fans. It's me, College Football with Sam, and today I am finally unveiling my 2023 SEC football predictions. I have been working on this video for several weeks, doing research, looking at record predictions, poring over the transfer portal, much like I did for my Big Ten and Pac-12 predictions as well. I'm very excited to get into this video. Like always, we start from the bottom and we arrive to the top. So we'll be starting with the worst in the SEC East, and we will be finishing with the best of the SEC West. I'm going to spend about 2 to 3 minutes per team in that area talking about their strengths, weaknesses, their schedule, touching on their head coach, some things I don't like and like about each team, and some uncertainties and certainties that I have. I'm very excited to get into this video, so let's kick off this episode talking about Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilt Commodores, I think, are going to be 7th place in the SEC East. I have them going 5-7, 1-7 in conference. Vanderbilt is easily the least talented team in the SEC, as all of us know. They have A.J. Swan at quarterback. Last year they had Ray Davis at running back, but he is transferring to Kentucky. I like Clark Lee, and I like the direction that Vanderbilt seems to be taking as opposed to the one it was taking under Derek Mason, but it will take time. I totally can see Vanderbilt going bowling this season. They have games against Hawaii, Alabama A&M, and road non-conference games against Wake Forest and UNLV. I think Vanderbilt is certainly better than all of those teams, minus maybe Wake Forest. They could totally upset a team like Kentucky, Missouri, maybe even a team like South Carolina or Florida. I have them beating Auburn, though, because I think Hugh Freeze has a habit, and Auburn has a habit of this too, of losing to teams that they have no business losing to. Vanderbilt just does not have a lot of talent, and playing teams like Georgia, Ole Miss, Tennessee, and heck, name the teams that I said they could upset. Kentucky, Auburn, Missouri, and even a team like Wake Forest on the road. It's going to be hard for Vanderbilt to go bowling in 2023. Can they do it? Certainly. Will they do it? That's an entirely different question. Running back, their staff, the defensive line, and quarterback should be strengths of this team. Skill positions in the receiver area should be absolute weaknesses. Defensively, this team should be schematically solid, as Clark Lee is a defensive mind. 6th place in the SEC East, I have the Florida Gators. I'm going to spend a little more time talking about Florida than perhaps other teams in this episode. Florida, led by head coach Billy Napier, or as Uncle Lou affectionately calls him, Sunbelt Billy. I am not sold on Billy Napier, nor am I selling all of his stock quite yet, even with this jarring 3-9, 1-7 prediction. Florida will have one of the worst records by a Power 5 team in the country. They'll have the worst record by far in the SEC. And I attribute that to the fact that they have the worst quarterback in the Power 5. Graham Mertz and Jack Miller. You do not want to get stuck with that quarterback duo. If I were a Florida fan, or I'm a Michigan fan, so if Michigan had Graham Mertz and Jack Miller as their quarterback, I would probably bury my head in the sand whenever the offense took the field. Graham Mertz was a turnover machine at Wisconsin. For him being a top 100 blue chip prospect out of high school, he has certainly not done that when he is at Wisconsin. And unless Paul Chryst was one of the worst coaches in the entire universe, which he wasn't, Graham Mertz is not going to get much better at Florida, especially when Florida has inferior tight ends, probably an inferior offensive line, inferior linebackers, and defense as well. Defense, of course, takes some of the pressure off of you, and Florida's going to be playing a tougher schedule than Wisconsin does most years. All in all, it's just not a good combination. It is really a terrible combination. And if Jaden Rashada stays at Florida, or if they get Grayson McCall, or they get Devin Leary, or even if they get like Cade McNamara, the season looks entirely different. Because all those guys that I just mentioned won't turn the ball over. They'll do well at their respective schools this season. Rashada at Arizona State, McCall at Coastal Carolina, and Cade McNamara at Iowa. At running back, with Montrell Johnson Jr. and Trevor Etienne, that is one of the best running back rooms in the nation. Ricky Parasil, he's good at wide receiver. The offensive line brings in some gamers there. Defensive line, too, should be stacked. All in all, though, I have a lot of questions about quarterback, along with tight end, linebacker, and defensive back. Florida is recruiting very well, though, as we have seen. They have the number 3 class in the nation. I guarantee you, though, DJ Lagaway is going to be starting immediately in 2024. This quarterback room is awful. 3-9, 1-7 in conference, a win over Vanderbilt with their opportunistic defense, and Florida's quarterback might be generous. And their schedule is so tough. Road game at Utah, home game against Florida State in the non-conference, and then also a game against Georgia, a road game against LSU. Florida has a brutal schedule, brutal quarterback room, and it puts Billy Napier in a tough place. But again, I'm not sold on him, nor am I selling his stock yet. It's too early to see how good of a head coach he is, but some of the decisions that he's made have been questionable, but he's recruiting well. So Florida is a team who I'm very fascinated to see, more so in the future than 2023, because I think even with that record, Napier has to survive. With the way they're recruiting, and I think they're going to be playing some tight games in those losses, you got to see the future and not just can a guy after 2 years, especially with where Mullen left them roster-wise when he was fired. At 5th, we have South Carolina. South Carolina under Shane Beamer has exceeded expectations year after year. With everything they've lost in the transfer portal, I originally was thinking about picking them to have a losing record. But I don't think Shane Beamer is that kind of coach. I think he is going to find ways to win. I think that's what South Carolina is. Whether it's against a North Carolina team in the first game that has a vastly superior quarterback, do not tell me that Spencer Rattler is better than Drake May. Whether it's against, finding wins wherever you can, not losing to all the inferior teams on your schedule like Vanderbilt, Florida, Mississippi State, Jacksonville State, or Furman. Maybe upsetting Clemson again. Maybe getting Kentucky or Missouri. There are a lot of ways South Carolina can win more than 6 games on this schedule. There are also ways where they go 5-7 or 4-8. They lost Marshawn Lloyd in the portal to USC, Jordan Birch on the D-line to Oregon, Jaheim Bell from tight end to Florida State, though they replaced him with Trey Knox from Arkansas, who's a solid tight end, definitely a top 25 tight end nationwide. And their special teams unit returns their punter, their kicker. I think they were the most effective special teams unit according to ESPN's efficiency metrics. So this team has a lot going for it. They have solid defensive backs, underrated wide receivers, and Spencer Rattler is a high-ceiling, low-floor kind of QB. You don't know what you're getting out of him week to week, and that's what makes South Carolina football more entertaining. Also because their punter can throw touchdown passes and trick plays. Shane Beamer, this team's just going to be fun. They're going to be a fun group. And they, like Florida, are recruiting well. So the SEC is just doing its thing. South Carolina, Florida, even these quote-unquote lower level schools are recruiting well. I think they're a program, certainly, though, that I'm more sold on than, let's say, the likes of Florida or Vanderbilt heading into the future. I'm rooting for Beamer's kid, that being Frank Beamer, who used to be a coach at Virginia Tech. I'm rooting for him. Up next, we got number 4 in the SEC East, Kentucky. South Carolina, I think I might have forgotten to say this, but I have them going 6-6, 3-5 in conference. Got a little too excited talking about how fun they are and talking about Shane Beamer. But 6-6, 3-5 is my prediction for South Carolina. Kentucky, and JT Sports, a YouTuber, will tell you this. Kentucky is one of the more underrated teams in the SEC. They bring in Ray Davis, who is a 1,000-yard rusher from Vanderbilt. They bring in Devin Leary, who was a great quarterback in 2021 and a quarterback hampered with injuries in 2022. Their defensive back room is going to be, it's just going to be awesome. Can't say anything else. On the defensive line, they're solid. And trench play overall is the name in the game of Kentucky. At wide receiver and at tight end, they do have some questions, but Mark Stoops is bringing back Liam Cohen, who was the offensive coordinator in the 2021 season, where they went 10-3, and Will Levis was playing like a top 25 quarterback rather than a project QB with no protection like he was in 2022. They also had Wan'Dale Robinson that year, very impressive college receiver. Kentucky's schedule, they have an opportunity to start off very strong heading into that Georgia game. I think they'll be undefeated heading into that Georgia game with wins over Ball State, Eastern Kentucky, Akron, Vanderbilt, Florida. They're playing some of the worst teams in the SEC and a bunch of MAC and FCS schools to open up the year. We will not know much about Kentucky. But like Ole Miss last year, things hit the fan pretty quickly. A road game against Georgia, Mississippi State, South Carolina, and Louisville, a rival, and then home games against Missouri, Tennessee, and Alabama. They have a game against Alabama and Georgia. So Kentucky has a tough schedule. We will find out if they're going to exceed expectations and tap into that potential that those who do their homework know that they have, or not. And I'm on the end of things where Devin Leary, I think that playing in the SEC is going to be different. While I think Kentucky is a good offensive line, a great D-line, and an elite defensive backfield, I think that, teams like Georgia, Alabama, that's just going to be tough. And then the Mississippi State and Missouri games are just perfectly placed for letdown or look-ahead spots. I think they upset Tennessee, and a road game against Louisville, while Kentucky could easily win that game, Jeff Brom has a knack of beating teams with far more talent and even with better head coaches than who he is and better talent than what his team has. So I think 7-5, but a 4-4, 500 record in the SEC, which is impressive given the schedule Kentucky has, is what is in for Mark Stoops and company this season. In third place, we have the Missouri Tigers. Missouri has an insanely talented wide receiver room with former 5-star Luther Burden. They have Brady Cook at quarterback. All in all, an impressive group, and their defense returns a ton of production. I think Missouri's in the top 25 of production this coming season, and I think they're higher than that on the defensive side of the ball. Running back, tight end, those are areas of concern, but wide receiver, even after losing Dominic Lovett to Georgia, is going to be an area of strength. I think Missouri is going to capitalize off of this high returning production. It's not going to turn into a season where, let's say they beat Georgia, or they don't beat Georgia, but they go 10-2. I don't think they're going to do that. But Eli Drinkwitz has had a hard time getting over that 6-6, 500 record in the regular season. I think he'll do it this year. And this is with a tough schedule, with home games against Kansas State, LSU, Tennessee, and road games at Kentucky, Georgia, and Arkansas. That's a tough schedule. Kansas State won the Big 12 last season, and this time Missouri gets them at home. And a lot of these games are winnable. The LSU, believe it or not, and Kansas State games are winnable. Same with on the road at Arkansas and Tennessee. The only game that I don't see as winnable would be Georgia. That's because they're Georgia. They'll just reload. And you already know, that's why I saved the SEC West for last, is you know who I have winning the East already, just by talking about Georgia that way. I think Georgia, just briefly as a spoiler alert, is a lock to win this division. I think their absolute floor is still winning. Barring complete chaos, their absolute floor is still winning the SEC East. That's it. Because they have an easy schedule, they're consistent, and they have elite talent. But Missouri returns quite a bit. You're not going to see green mistakes. They're going to have veterans. And Luther Burden, watch out for him, because he'll quickly fill Dominic Lovett's shoes. And Brady Cook at quarterback, underrated, dual threat guy. I think that he will help Missouri's cause to improve from their previous seasons of mediocrity. In second place, we have Tennessee. The Tennessee Volunteers, I think, are going to take a step back from their 2022 counterparts, but they have Joe Milton at quarterback. They have Ramel Keaton and Dont'E Thornton and Squirrel White at wide receiver. So they have a loaded wide receiver room. They lose most guys on the offensive line, so they should take a step back there as well, especially their high-profile tackle who was drafted, I think, in the first round of the NFL. Name escapes me. But they should be great offensively because the offense that Heupel runs, quick tempo, air raid, putting wide receivers all the way almost out of bounds, it's incredible. It works on everyone except the likes of Georgia. Even worked on Alabama last season. I think that losing Hendon Hooker, though, is going to hurt. Statistically, it may not look like that, but Joe Milton, take it from a Michigan fan, I think he's going to be a top 15 quarterback this season, but I think his decision-making and his efficiency will not be on the same level that Hendon Hooker's was. He has a bigger arm. In theory, he has higher upside, and I think with the wide receivers practically reloading, Tennessee's offense might statistically, in the passing game department, get better. Tennessee, also, something that I really want to talk about in regards to Tennessee, is how underrated they are at the running back position. Jamari Small has been with the program for years. And they also have center Cooper Mays, who I think is going to be an all-SEC caliber center. So they do have the potential to also have a potent run game. Now, how potent will it be compared to last year's run game where they could run on Alabama and it helped them win? Who knows? But we'll have to wait and see. The defense, look, the defense is something that with Tennessee is never going to be elite so far, with how their offense runs, the fact they don't care about time of possession, and that they haven't recruited at that Georgia or Alabama level where you can just reload. But they should be the strongest at linebacker and the weakest at secondary, where they had one of the worst secondaries in the SEC in 2022. I expect losses to Alabama, Kentucky, Georgia, but wins over Texas A&M, on the road at Florida, which has been a hard place for Tennessee to win, on the road at Missouri, who will be an underrated team who has top 25 potential, and they could beat Kentucky, maybe could beat Georgia. If one team in the SEC East is to beat Georgia, it will be Tennessee, because it's a home game. Tennessee will have a lot of time to prepare. I don't see Tennessee, well, that's a lie. They could beat Alabama, but I don't see Tennessee going above really 10-2 with this schedule. There are too many letdown spots. They lost too much, and they don't quite have the talent yet with the schedule that they have, which is one of the tougher ones in the East, maybe the SEC overall, to win their division. Just not yet. And speaking of, the only school that I think has the potential to win the East, who will win it by a wide margin, is Georgia. 12-0, 8-0 in conference. 12-0 and 8-0. That is my prediction for Georgia. The Georgia Bulldogs are loaded everywhere. Their weakness is special teams and running back, and even then they're A-minuses. Everywhere else has the potential to be one of the best groups nationwide. Tight end, you have Brock Bowers and Oscar Delp. Defensively, Jalen Carter is going to be replaced with Nazir Stackhouse. In the defensive backfield, guys like Keely Ringo and Christopher Smith. Just plug and play with Malachi Starks, Dalen Everett, and other players back there. Also, don't forget that Michael Williams is on that defensive line. True freshman last season, got playing time, started in games. There are just so many players for Georgia's defense that losing all that they did in 2021 and 2022 barely matters. And the defense took a step back from its 2021 unit compared to 2022, but the offense then, they compensated for that. Stetson Bennett went from looking like you could still make excuses that he was a supporting cast quarterback, a game manager, to now, and I was guilty of this even in 2022, but it was clear as day after Georgia went 15-0 that Stetson Bennett transformed from 21 to 22. Phenomenal quarterback. I hope he has success in the NFL. At wide receiver, Georgia will be the best that it's ever been, with Ra Thomas, Arian Smith, Dominic Lovett, Ladd McConkey, and others. Of course, they lost, I forget, A.D. Mitchell almost forgot his name. They lost him to Texas due to what I interpret as a family situation with Mitchell. 5-star wide receiver in the portal, but it's not going to hurt Georgia much. They're so deep there. They're already deep at tight end. Cedric Van Pran, their center, returns. Georgia is one of the few, one of the few, if not the only team in the SEC East that I care about, because they're the only team that can win that division. No one else is coming close. Tennessee might beat them. Auburn, who's out of the division, and therefore Georgia could afford to lose that game, and their title hopes for the SEC are not in jeopardy. Not even their playoff hopes with the reputation they've developed. If they lose early to Auburn or early to Tennessee but still win the SEC, they'll get their spot at the table. Even if they lose like a game, just a random game, Tennessee does not have the cohesiveness, they don't have the depth, they don't have the recruiting, and they don't even have the schedule to allow them to go 7-1 in the SEC to get that tie-breaking win. And all the tough games for Georgia, for the most part, outside of Tennessee and maybe Auburn, are at home. Kentucky, Ole Miss. Ole Miss is probably going to be the best team on their schedule. Maybe Tennessee will challenge them for that. And Georgia gets them at home. And Georgia is several Mount Everests above every other team on their schedule. So Kirby Smart once again is going to have an undefeated regular season for the third year in a row, and he'll punch his ticket to the SEC championship game. We have 7th in the SEC West, Mississippi State. Mississippi State, unfortunately, Mike Leach passed. Rest in peace, the founder of the air raid offense. And now his defensive coordinator, Zach Arnett, who led one of the better defenses in 2022, something that really caught me off guard, and helped Mississippi State to beat Illinois in their bowl game, and they finished top 25 with a 9-4 record. Unfortunately, despite the return of Will Rogers at quarterback, I do see this team taking a step back, largely because just the amount of guys they lost through the portal, and they're changing and adapting their scheme. Defensively, they should be good. They should be solid on special teams, and Will Rogers was a good quarterback, so they'll be set there. But running back, wide receiver, and a staff that I think has questions all around is going to hold them back. Plus, they have a tough schedule because they play in the SEC West. Have a home game against Alabama, Kentucky, LSU, but they have road games also at South Carolina, Arkansas, Auburn, Texas A&M, and they host Ole Miss at the end of the year. They have a non-conference Power 5 opponent in Arizona, and they have cupcake games against Western Michigan, Southern Miss, and Southeastern. I think 5-7, 1-7 in conference might be a little low for this team. They could easily go bowling. They could go 7-5. I'd look at games like South Carolina, Arkansas, even Auburn, maybe Ole Miss, since it's a rivalry game, as games where they could flip and into wins. Defensively, again, they're going to be very impressive. I look at this team, and it's just going to be rebuild and rebuild. Will Rogers returned, but for example, his backup quarterbacks departed. The running back room was gutted. Dylan Johnson went off to Washington. So there's going to have to be recruiting, reloading, but Mississippi State has used the portal, so we'll see how they are. But I'm picking them to finish in the bottom of the SEC West this season. Up next, we have Arkansas, the Razorbacks, and Sam Pittman in 6th place. I think they are due to improve because they return quarterback KJ Jefferson, who's going to be a top 10 quarterback this year, potentially a Heisman caliber quarterback, a Doak Walker Award candidate in running back Raheem Sanders, and on the offensive line, they have one of the best linemen in the country in Brady Latham, who I think is the best offensive guard in the SEC, potentially one of the best guards in the nation. So Arkansas is offense, offense, offense. And where do you get this from? Well, you get it from the fact that Dan Enos was hired away from Maryland after leading quality offenses for several years in a row there, for 2 exactly. And he developed Taulia Tagovailoa into a good quarterback. I imagine that he will continue what Kendall Briles started at Arkansas, which is just scoring points after points after points. So Arkansas, they have no worries on the offensive side of the ball. They did lose Trey Knox to South Carolina, of course, the tight end. But I think all in all, they bring some guys in through the portal. And when you return an elite offensive guard, an elite quarterback, and an elite running back, and your coach has a history working with the offensive line, and you reformed your staff to where you hired Travis Williams to be your defensive coordinator. Travis Williams was recently, at UCF, and then before that he was at Auburn for several years working under Gus Malzahn. I think that this team is set to improve, period, amen. The question is going to be defensively. That's where the question marks are going to be for the Arkansas Razorbacks. Their schedule, they face Texas A&M in a neutral site, but they have an absolutely brutal stretch around that Texas A&M game. It's going to be hard. They have several road games there. I mean, at LSU versus A&M, at Ole Miss, at Alabama. They're not going to play at home for a month. So I imagine that's going to wear down on these players. The schedule does not work to Arkansas's advantage. If you spread out some of these games and maybe include some tougher games in the month of, let's say, November, or even have Arkansas open up in a conference game, which I don't know if the SEC does that. But anyway, they could go 8-4, or maybe 9-3, and they could flip a game or two. Most of these games are winnable, I'd say, outside of the road game against Alabama, but Auburn, A&M for sure, those are games that could be flipped. Ole Miss and even LSU, given the fact that Arkansas has played LSU close or beaten them straight up under Sam Pittman, that's always a game to look out for, the rivalry game of the Golden Boot. I think that Arkansas will finish 7-5, obviously beating most of their opponents in BYU, Kent State, Western Carolina, conference foes Mississippi State, Florida, Missouri, along with a late non-conference game in FIU, but they'll lose to Alabama and LSU, putting them out of reach to win the SEC West. Speaking of a team who many thought would win the SEC West last year, I still think A&M is too far behind. They're too far behind to compete for the playoffs, and it's hard for me to see them even compete for the conference this season. They have gamers like Walter Nolan and Shamar Stewart on that defensive line. They have great defensive backs, linebackers. They lost Denver Harris to LSU, for example, 5-star cornerback, and they still might have a better defensive back room than LSU does. They're very deep defensively, and DJ Durkin's their defensive coordinator. They have good special teams, at least from efficiency metrics. I trust their defense. What we don't trust, and what we'll have to wait until the games play to find out, is what about the offense? What about Connor Weigman? What about, for example, Evan Stewart at wide receiver and Moose Muhammad? What about an offensive line that's now going to be coached by Steve Adazio, who is closer to being a sandbag than an offensive line coach? And Bobby Petrino, same question could be said about him. Has the game passed him by? Has it passed him by? I was looking at all these things and looking at his time at Louisville and other schools. You don't know. Texas A&M is an unknown, and I don't know if they're going to go 10-2 or 7-5. I don't think they're going to go 5-7 or 6-6, but I think that 8-4, getting back to the quote-unquote normal, something that A&M fans probably dread, is what's due for A&M, which means this team will be top 25-ish, but they won't be top 15, top 10, though there is always the potential for them to reach that. I think they're going to make a statement win on the road at Miami, but they will be cooled down by a home upset against Auburn. They'll beat Arkansas, South Carolina, Mississippi State, Abilene Christian, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, the games that they're supposed to win, but they'll get upset by Auburn. They'll lose to Alabama at home, and road games against Tennessee and LSU are just so hard to ask for as wins. But with the talent A&M has, in theory, this should be a top 15, top 10 team. They're top 20 in returning production. Defensively, they're just impressive. And Connor Weigman, 5-star quarterback out of high school, Jimbo Fisher claimed that he was the best in the country. And while many of us non-SEC fans, non-A&M fans will mock him for that, Weigman threw no interceptions last year, 8 touchdowns, and looked phenomenal against LSU's defense in the final game of the season. So maybe A&M can cook up something and surprise us all. They also have a top 25 portal class, but a lot of it is filler because they lost a ton of players. Their attrition this preseason was insane, so they did bring in a lot of bodies, but in their 1 deep and for most of their 2 deep, they're going to have mostly 4 and 5-star players. So A&M is a question mark team for sure. We're just going to have to see how it all plays out. But I think A&M is destined to improve. In 4th place, we have Auburn, another team who I think is going to improve. But a team that doesn't have A&M's talent, and a team under first-year head coach Hugh Freeze, a guy with a past in the SEC, positive in that he's beaten Nick Saban twice, also that I think he'll do it again in year 1, negative in practically everything else. We won't touch on that. They have an awesome running back in Jarquez Hunter. At quarterback, they have a competition going on between Peyton Thorne and Robbie Ashford. I think iron sharpens iron there, and both quarterbacks improve from that battle. They rebuild the offensive line and defensive line via the portal. They have several incoming 4 and 5-star portal players on both the lines. Everywhere else, they should be solid. This team is deeper than what you would typically think of when you look with the naked eye. And that's just because Brian Harsin went 6-7 and 5-7 with this team in 2021 and 2022, respectively. Auburn, like usual, has one of the toughest schedules in the country. They play Georgia, LSU, Alabama, A&M. They even have a Power 5 road game, non-conference at California, though California is not very good. I think that this team should easily start out 3-0. I do think they're going to beat A&M, but then they're hit with a brutal 3-game stretch against Georgia, LSU, Ole Miss, all of which I think will be losses. They will lose in typical Hugh Freeze fashion, a game that they have no business losing, and I think that's against a well-coached, underrated Vanderbilt team. But I do have them beating Alabama. It's a home game. Nick Saban has never beaten an Auburn team that is ranked, that is a top 25 quality team on the road. It's a hard place to win for any team, especially Alabama, because the history of the Iron Bowl, teams always get up for rivalries. I look at that game and I think that Alabama's run game and Auburn's run game, and I think the fact that Alabama might have the inferior, this is interesting, might have the inferior quarterback to Auburn. And Hugh Freeze's system, whether it's at Liberty, Ole Miss, the players adapt to it quickly. And I think Auburn will be a team that scores a lot of points. I think defensively, much like Arkansas, that's what we're going to have to look out for. It's going to be the inverse of A&M. We're going to have to pay attention to the defense. In 3rd place, we have Ole Miss. Lane Kiffin once again is using the transfer portal to his advantage. He brought in 2 quarterbacks to compete with Jackson Dart in the spring. These were not Jackson Dart, my apologies, but Spencer Sanders and Walker Howard from Oklahoma State and LSU respectively. Ole Miss has a top 5 transfer portal class with 25 signees and an average recruit ranking of 88.63. One of their higher ranked guys that they are bringing in, for example, there's so many of them to look at, but Zamari Walton at cornerback. They lost Davison Igbinosun to Ohio State. So Ole Miss, they have outgoing transfers, incoming transfers, but they're also bringing in, for example, Zachary Franklin, a wide receiver from UTSA. They're bringing in Taja Young, a safety from Florida Atlantic. And again, Spencer Sanders, Walker Howard, Monty Montgomery, a 91 overall linebacker from Louisville. Bring in Victor Kern, an interior offensive lineman from Washington. They're bringing in Caden Prieskorn, brother of, I forget his name, but he's committed to Michigan, younger Prieskorn, who's a tight end. Both are tight ends. Caden Prieskorn had over 600 receiving yards at Memphis as a tight end. 92 overall. He's going to have an immediate impact there. Ole Miss also brings in Chris Marshall, a wide receiver from Texas A&M. And they also have other wide receivers of 4-star caliber and corners of 4-star caliber coming in. Let's just say this. This team should be fast. They're going to be athletic. They have, at linebacker, they recruited a 5-star in the 2022 class. They have Quinshon Judkins at running back. Quarterback should be the weakness of this team. Wide receiver, linebacker, defensive back, running back should be the strength. Trench play, overall size, and also you got to remember team cohesiveness. How together will the team be? That's a consequence of using the transfer portal, is team chemistry. That can be something that deteriorates the more transfers you add. What's that going to do? Ole Miss has a crazy tough schedule. It's tougher than Auburn's because Alabama and Georgia are on the road for Ole Miss. They're not at home like they are for Auburn. I think they're going to lose those 2 games. They're also going to lose to Texas A&M, which I think is going to be a look-ahead spot, as Ole Miss will be preparing for Georgia. But they'll upset LSU. They'll play a tough, underrated road game at Tulane, who will be the best. They'll be the best non-Power 5 opponent that anyone could face or schedule. Ole Miss has them. They could be top 25 if they beat Ole Miss, which is a realistic possibility as Michael Pratt returns there at quarterback. Lane Kiffin will also win the Egg Bowl, like he did in 2021, but avenge his 2022 loss to, again, Mike Leach. Rest in peace. In second place, we have LSU, and by now you know who I have winning the SEC West. LSU is a team that I've been back and forth on. Between Alabama and LSU, I can't quite decide who's going to win the SEC West. I do think Georgia is better than both Alabama and LSU this year, and part of me thinks it is by a wide margin. LSU had trash special teams last season. It'll improve this year, but I still think it will be near the bottom, if not at the bottom, of the league. And by league, I mean the FBS. An example of this would be Michigan State's secondary from 2021 to 2022. It improved a little, but not enough to be impactful whatsoever. What is impactful for LSU is bringing in a guy like Omar Spates at linebacker, Denver Harris at defensive back, having the linebacker Harold Perkins, who's a unicorn, having him around for another year of preseason work. At wide receiver, Malik Neighbors, who's a top 10 wide receiver, got 1,000 yards in 2022. He's back. And then Jalen Daniels and Garrett Nussmeier. That's quite the quarterback room. And this staff, Mike Denbrock is OC, Matt House is DC, and Brian Kelly, as much as I don't like him in general, I'm not a big fan of him, but I got to admit he did a good job, and he proved me wrong. I thought that LSU last year was not going to be good, potentially a disaster. But even after that Florida State loss, and even after that Tennessee blowout, he kept his team together. He beat Nick Saban the first year he was in the SEC West. You got to give props to Brian Kelly. And they once again face Florida State, once again in a neutral site on a Sunday, but this time it's in a neutral site in Florida. I think in Jacksonville. I think they will get revenge on Florida State with a healthy Mason Smith, who's one of the best defensive tackles. LSU's defense, that will be one of the best defenses, at least from an upside and talent perspective, nationwide. And I think when it comes to scoring total yards, especially when stopping the run with that impressive front seven, they'll be phenomenal. I think they have one of the best linebacker rooms, potentially the best in the country. I think a road game at Ole Miss will prove troublesome. Potentially a road game at Missouri could as well. But they avoid Georgia. I think Alabama will get revenge on this team, as Alabama has a 90% blue chip ratio. And Nick Saban, I can't see him losing to Brian Kelly 2 years in a row. He hasn't lost to anyone 2 years in a row outside of Hugh Freeze. He might to Kirby Smart this season. We'll have to see, as obviously those two teams are the teams that I have projected to reach the SEC championship game, but it is what it is. So, second place in the SEC West, a 10-2, 6-2 record in conference. And first place, we finally have the Alabama Crimson Tide. Strengths for this team should be the entire defense, tight end, running back, Jace McClellan and Roydell Williams. That's going to be a running back duo that will be up there. Top 10 running back duo for sure. I don't know if I'd classify any of those two backs as top 10 individually, but they also have backs behind those two. They recruited very well in high school, and they got some underrated pickups in the transfer portal with C.J. Dupree, for example, along with Trey Amos at corner, Tresman Marshall at linebacker. At wide receiver, Ja'Cory Brooks should be a top 10 wide receiver in the nation. He doesn't have a lot of depth behind him. I'm not a big fan of Jermaine Burton, but I'm a huge fan of Ja'Cory Brooks, and I think he'll be that potentially X-factor wide receiver that Bama has, which will keep them afloat and allow them to return on top of their division. I think a loss on the road at Auburn is due for this team. It'll be either that or a home loss to Texas or a road loss to Texas A&M. I think out of those 3 games, Alabama is due to slip up in one of them. And the reasons for that being, 1, Texas, it's early in the year. Texas is the most talented team Alabama faces on the schedule. Texas is an underrated quarterback room. If Quinn Ewers isn't playing at the elite level that everyone thinks he will, newsflash, I think Malik Murphy is better, and I don't think Quinn Ewers is better than anything at a good level. I think if Texas starts Malik Murphy, they could win the national title. That's how good I think Malik Murphy is compared to Quinn Ewers, but I'm not on staff. Steve Sarkisian knows better than I do. Anyway, Texas also has a great defense, a wide receiver core that will be able to challenge Alabama's defensive backs that include Caleb Downs and Kool-Aid McKinstry. Texas A&M, they also have a defense that can shut down Alabama's offense. It's a loud place. Jimbo's played him competitively for 2 years and went 1-1 against Saban. And Auburn, it's the Hugh Freeze effect. Again, a rival, a hard place to play. And Hugh Freeze is schematically, he played Saban close 3 years in a row, beat him in dominant fashion in 2015 when Alabama won it all, and beat him at home in Vaught-Hemingway Stadium in 2014 in a close come-from-behind victory. I think Alabama falls to Auburn, but if you want to argue they fall to Texas or Texas A&M, I'd buy that. This team could go 10-2, at worst 9-3 in the regular season, but they could also go 12-0 and be the best team in the country. They're the most talented team in the country by team total talent composite and by the blue chip ratio. So Saban, I don't think he's going anywhere. I just think with the controversy at quarterback with Tyler Buckner, Jalen Milroe, with the weakness there and weaknesses at the O-line and wide receiver compared to other elite programs, I don't think this team's going to win it all or even escape undefeated from the regular season. But I could be wrong. Those are my SEC predictions for the 2023 college football season. Thank you all for watching very much. I enjoyed making this video. I enjoyed doing my research. And if you have any questions or comments, criticisms, comment your thoughts down below. And make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can get notified when I post new content. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.